Oh, hey, Bill, how are you?
Good,
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I didn't know which side you were going to come from. I haven't left here. I've just having been fun learning all sorts of things.
I can tell.
We've had many questions about the field of oncology, what technology is doing, about alliances and sharing of data. And let me just start off with just a general question. Where are we going to be 5 years from now if you do your job well?
Oh, excellent question. I think what you will see is a breakdown of silos. Today, if a patient is taken care of, say, one hospital, and then needs to go to another hospital, even in the same community, the physician and practice plan that is seeing that patient for the first time knows nothing about the patient. The ability to communicate.
And that's standard, right?
That's standard. That's standard. Unless the patient has actually copied their history and taken it with them, today, the ability to exchange information about a patient's care is not there.
We had a lady back here that asked the question of, can she get her own information and put it somewhere? Is that what Orion is?
Well, Orion is working...
Tell folks what Orion is.
So Orion stands for Oncology Research Information Exchange Network. So we are building the platform so that a patient's data would be available to anybody that had the proper credentials to access it. But it is, as the R stands, Orion, in the research phase. We're developing the capability to exchange data for learning and ultimately in developing better approaches to addressing decisions made at the point of care. But that's a journey.
How many case files do you have in it now?
This effort in following patients, let me give you a little background. It's now 11 years ago at Moffitt, while I was CEO there. The team came up with an idea of what if we could learn from every patient that entered our door? And we felt the best way to do that was to ask permission. So we asked patients permission. May we study you throughout your lifetime? Will you donate your data, your clinical data, throughout your lifetime so that we can learn? And will you donate tissue for us to study using different molecular technologies so that we'll understand the molecular, if you will, nuance of every patient, which dictates how they respond to therapy, for example. And by allowing us to follow that data and to study the patients and their specimens, we also ask them, if we learn something that might benefit you, will you allow us to contact you? You actually have to ask patients permission. You can't just do all those things without saying...
This was 11 years ago?
This was 11 years ago.
So can I just ask, was your science, were your questions and methodology sophisticated enough 11 years ago to ask the right things on the front end?
Yes, I think asking the questions, it was sophisticated enough. When we launched the protocol, which was in 2006, what we weren't sophisticated enough is, what do we do with all this data? How do we manage the data? How do we access the data? It became a stunning reality to me that patients were very eager to donate their data, very eager to donate their specimens to be studied. But we were generating so much data so fast that in 2006 we did not have the capability of storing the data and putting it in an infrastructure that would allow us to analyze it. So we actually embarked on an effort that took us 2.5 years, working with multiple partners in the IT informatics realm to build what was called the Health Research Informatics Platform. I'm proud to say that at Moffitt, this was one of the first
And that came out of Moffitt?
That came out of Moffitt, right.
And it is allied with research centers all around the world, around the country?
Right now, it's primarily in the country. What started at Moffitt 10 years ago is now at 15 different cancer centers throughout the United States. And these are well-known: City of Hope, University of South Carolina, University of Virginia, et cetera. So they're all agreeing to utilize the same protocol, asking the patient's consent, utilizing the same process, and all 15 centers, which, by the way, is growing. We have 8 more centers that have asked to come in. Are agreeing to share data on patients who are volunteering their data.
Are there innovations, are there strategic leaps in the science and technology that you can now say, hey, we are responsible for creating a platform for X? What can you brag about?
Oh, excellent. That's pretty easy. What I'm thrilled at is once the data system was created, We can now ask questions and address those questions in weeks to months, whereas previously it would take us years. Let me give you an example. A team at Moffitt was interested in a signature that would predict response to therapy. And they studied patients who had already donated their data, who we had done analysis on, and found a signature that would, by that I mean a molecular signature that would predict response and how well they would do. So that was very exciting for patients with melanoma. Well, the obvious question is, would it work? Would that same signature work for other cancers? Now, to address that question, if you didn't already have the data, it would have taken you about 5 to 6 years to generate the data to answer the question. Because our system had already followed it and generated data, and it was analyzable, within 3 months, they found that what worked, or what was discovered in one disease, also occurred in 39 other cancers in a period of a few months. Again, that would have taken years to be able to do.
So you were able to take a whack at 39 cancers from one bit of data
Bingo.
that you had on file.
That's right.
So the other question that's come up, a couple of times in our conversations this morning has been about the bridge between really super turbocharged centers like yourself, real centers of excellence, and communities, community oncologists. We had Rafael Blanco up here, who was somewhat lamenting the pressures that many oncologists feel to keep up. He says they need to keep up, and that they're becoming specialists as opposed to remaining in that generalist category, just being driven by that. How would you, given the fact that you're on the other side, you're a CEO of this big center, and now running this, these advanced centers, what do you think needs to be done to even out literacy across the communities that are struggling with longer living patients, but with kind of cancer treatment in general?
Well, I think what we create at a center needs to be exportable. We can't expect every patient to come to a Moffitt or any one of these members of Orion. What we should be able to do is, when we build something and it's of value, export it. So the capability of enrolling a patient in this system should be well done by Dr. Blanco at any facility. Ultimately, it's accessibility and inclusivity of what we've created that drives this. If you believe your effort, your approach has value, then export it. Don't insist that the patient come to you. Take it to the patient.
Are there things that make that easier? If I'm a patient in Salina, Kansas, and you're going to be, how do you reach me?
Well, that's excellent. We formed a patient advocacy council about 8 years ago. We ask patients, all right, you're donating your data, you're donating your tissue, we're making discoveries, what can we give back to you? They quite quickly said, give us back our own data so that we can use it and participate in decision making. That was the, quote, the birth of the patient portal at Moffitt, so that we now began to give back data so that they understand what their situation is and they can actually have a conversation with their physician because they're looking at the same data. So the patient advocacy group also said, look, you need to broadcast this, of what you're doing. So with Orion, which is again the 15 cancer centers and growing, we are building a global website so that when a patient is diagnosed with cancer, they'll go in and hopefully they'll find the Total Cancer Care website, when we'll educate them about what the process is. It is a research protocol which will study you, but what we can do now is basically assign every patient that comes into our system to a community that looks like them. So patients want to know, am I alone with this disease? And if I'm not, what are the experiences of others? There's an organization called Patients Like Me that has been around for about 5 years that is very similar. But in that case, it's just, what it's based on is patient self-reported data. What is the patient willing to say? It's not their actual records. What we're doing is taking their records and generating new data, molecular data, genetic data, that is valued. So it expands this ability to understand that any patient anywhere should be able to enroll themselves in this effort and then say, this is my community. I look most like these patients. So that's what we're building.
I don't want to get too wonky for the audience, but years ago, with The Atlantic had a cover story, and it was about lab rats, but it was about companies in partnership with universities, and essentially something called the Bayh-Dole Act. And the Bayh-Dole Act allowed universities to have equity positions essentially in the research that was done. Every university that's big is trying to put their stakes in something, grow it, but have a commercial sense. The concern was that it was eroding the commons, the commons of sharing, that science is this place where big institutions share across and that science builds on one another, and that market encroachment was undermining that. And I'm just interested in whether, this piece was written, in about, I guess about 15 years ago.
Right.
What do you think that the health of the commons in science is today in the cancer research area?
Well, I think it's healthier than it has been. Well, I've been at this for 35 years. I've never seen it, what I'm seeing now.
And now you're a businessman, right?
I do business, yes.
Yeah.
I wouldn't classify it as a businessman per se. But what you're seeing is a recognition by these individual centers and universities, recognizing they can't do this alone. And recognizing that if you do come together as a collaboration and share data, you're going to win. But you'll be part of a group that wins vis-a-vis just a winner. And you're going to do it much faster and frankly better by collaboration. There's a business process called the ecosystem of shared value. And it was written, it's a study and approach by Harvard business professors. And the idea was different sectors come together to build something that no one sector can do by itself. And that's what I believe we're doing. We're building this information system, and it requires, yes, it requires universities, the Moffitts, but it also requires the community at large. It requires pharma. It requires payers, providers to come together and contribute to building a system that everybody would have access to and then share it.
Is that something people evolve towards because they are of goodwill, or is that something they have to be dragged into by legislation and policy and rewards and punishment?
All of the above. I think it starts with like-minded institutions recognizing that actually they will be in the lead if they collaborate. And once the other institutions that are, say, stragglers recognize, well, this group are making all the discoveries, then maybe we should join the group. And so success begets success. That's what you're starting to see now, is, all right, it's better to be part of something big than remain in your silo. And so the silos of data are breaking down. And so I actually am more optimistic than I've ever been.
I just grabbed this sheet, and it happens to be, I'm not doing an ad for BMS, but I was noticing in this sheet that they put out of the incidence rate of cancer in Florida, the mortality rate, that it's running lower than the national average, which is interesting. And I'm interested in whether or not that's because Moffitt is so great, or what do you think the factors are?
I'm not about to deny
because
that.
I do think that when you're running lower than the average, I wouldn't say it's dramatically lower, but I mean it's statistically significantly lower. Is there something going on within the ecosystem here that is setting up a model that others might emulate? Because I think that is when you talk about exporting, sometimes we're talking about models, trying to get things right. Wellness is a big issue when I look at the factors, obesity, being overweight, smoking, tanning, as factors that are big in Florida with regards to these. Are there things that you see in terms of frames and practices that are great here that might be good lessons for others?
Well, I do think, so when we launched this total cancer care approach over 10 years ago, within 18 months, 9 hospitals and systems joined the effort. And we found that they were more than capable of participating in this. So it is exportable. And the idea, again, of improving inclusivity and accessibility to care, extremely important. But you touched on something with wellness. It's much better to prevent something than to treat it. And so we've got to begin, and I do think you're seeing industry beginning to work with their employees to create programs whereby, again, we can learn what are patients at risk for and what can we do to intervene. I don't know that there's anything magical about Florida other than it's a great place. But again, I do think this idea of sharing information is pivotal because we learn more quickly. And the more quickly you learn, the more you can disseminate that information and knowledge. I think it's going to have an impact.
I know you have a real interest in personalized care, and when we began the forum today, I asked the question of the folks on the thing about how do you keep the human being, the person, the human on your dashboard so that you're there, because this is so easily swamped by data and
Right.
systems, and people being, particularly in the practitioner side, just overwhelmed. And I've always wondered whether personalized medicine actually solves that problem, and I know this is part of what your deep interest in is. But how do you answer that question of keeping people really at the center of what's going
Right.
on, and do you think it's a problem?
I think it's a challenge. And the patient-centric approach is definitely the way to go. And in fact, our total cancer care system begins with engaging the patient. We ask permission. May we follow you? So that means they have to sign a consent and agree to allow us to do it. And we give them their consent, and now they can visit their consent anytime they want. And as we build the portals for their own information, you have to continuously give back. And again, this patient advocacy group that we formed years ago, we asked them, what can we give back to you? I think what we don't want to do as physicians and scientists are assume we know what the patient wants. We have to ask what the patient wants. The personal approach, for example, we thought, all right, patients want their data back. So do you just provide it the same way? No, not all patients want their data back. Not all patients want it back in the same way as, you have to ask them, what do you want to know? And when do you want to know it? How do you want to be informed? You have to make that personal as well. So keep the patient in front and ask, don't assume. And you have to do it on an individual basis.
I read Siddhartha Mukherjee's book. I don't know if you've read Emperor of All
yeah.
Maladies.
Yes.
And for those of you who don't know Sid Mukherjee's book, I really highly recommend it. It's really a history book more than a science. It's science and history.
Right.
But when you go through and you read that journey of cancer, if you will, over the ages, but also dealing with it, it seemed like this gladiatorial, crazy fight with like different kinds of warfare dealing with this. And you seem so polite and nice that
There are
I'm
people out
wondering,
there that'll debate that,
yeah,
I'm sure.
that when you kind of look at what a struggle it is to kind of get to where we're at. I'm just interested in your role in this and kind of reflecting on that, what you think the next big challenges are, or whether there's going to be I don't mean to be too silly about the physical dimensions of struggling with cancer, but what you see as the big hurdles that have to be clobbered to actually shelve that battle?
I want to make sure what battle we're talking about.
Well, of just really kind of making cancer, living with cancer, dealing with cancer, how do I say it, chronic more than...
Okay, excellent. I think there are different facets to that question. One is in the therapy. Cancer is something that basically is going to happen. We're all at risk for. 1 out of 4 individuals will develop cancer. And in fact, the longer you live, the greater the likelihood that you will have cancer. So recognition that it's likely to occur. And no matter what we do, every once in a while the body makes a mistake. In this case, in the DNA and the replication of the DNA, a mistake occurs. That's called a mutation. Cancer occurs. I think so to recognize that it is going to happen. So the best thing to do is develop a system, all right, the recognition that I'm at risk, and then prevent. Do what you can to prevent, detect it early.
Right.
And so early detection and the right diagnosis from the beginning is the best way. It improves outcomes enormously. And then there's, of course, treatments. When I started my career 30 years ago, it was you gave as much chemotherapy as you possibly could give to try to kill every cell. Well, guess what? We injured many, many people that way, and we didn't succeed in eliminating every cell. We're learning now of how to, if you will, dose adjust and prevent resistance to the therapy, and we're developing an entirely
And this is
new...
that adaptive therapy.
This is adaptive therapy, exactly. So tailor-making the therapy based on the patient's own genetics is going to be very, very important. And you're seeing, for example, a disease I treated for many years was myeloma. It's a blood disorder. And the average survival when I began my efforts in the mid-'80s, the average survival was 3 years. Now with targeted-based therapies, patients are living 10, 15, 20 years. And it's a disease that they get in their 60s, by and large. So through understanding the nuance of every individual and target-based therapy. So new research that will target the uniqueness of an individual's tumor is a major step. But another aspect of this is, again, also, if you will, psychological. Listening to the Bob, the survivor, men go through denial. Denial's not a good thing. You don't discover things early. So the psychology of understanding what we're at risk for and intervening before the actual manifestation of it. So I think those are parts of it, education.
Just before we go to the audience, wrap this up, one of the other conversations we've been having is what are the kind of clusters of support? You're on this, the science, and you're developing new drugs and biotech issues, and you've been on the delivering these services. Just from your insider perspective there, looking out at communities, there are a lot of folks doing community work, social work. What would you like to say to them that would, from your perspective, be a useful net add to the ecosystem?
Well, as I mentioned, we have 15 different cancer centers that have joined this effort, with many more coming on board. That's only a part of it. In fact, if you look at the overall population, centers like Moffitt and Dana-Farber and MD Anderson treat 20% of all cancer in the United States. That means 80% of the treatments are actually in the community where patients live. We need to create a platform and a forum for discussion to engage the community day one. And in our practice with the Total Cancer Care Protocol, we know that the community can do this. They can enroll patients. We can follow those patients. What we need to do now that we couldn't do 10 years ago is give the information back. So we're at the point now so that the physician in Kissimmee could enroll the patient into the system without the patient having to come to Moffitt. And that same physician can then ask, all right, how many patients look like the one I just saw today? We should be able to tell them, your patient looks like this population. We call it the community. What was used to treat that community? You can stratify based on what therapies were used to treat that community. What were the outcomes? So that kind of information needs to be gathered from the community, but also studied and provided back to the community so that the physician is looking at real evidence of what works and what doesn't work for the patient that physician is seeing right now. That's the only way this is going to work. So, engagement. And we need a system. This requires payers to encourage it, provider systems to encourage it, a willingness to come together, as opposed to remain in our silos and we need to create this ecosystem of sharing. That's the bottom line.
Fascinating. Well, let me open up the floor to questions and comments. Yes, we've got one right here. This is one of the great cancer science leaders of America here. It's fascinating.
Rushang Dave, Department of Pathology at USF, College of Medicine. We know, and you know, that there is intertumoral as well as intratumoral heterogeneity, and now, in America, we also have heterogeneous populations. So how does precision medicine, which you will be the boss on it because you will be having all the data coming out, help as we move forward because of this heterogeneity?
Could you hear?
Not all.
Come on up here because we're not going to be able to hear. Come, and drop the preamble. Just throw this the question.
So my question is, between patients, we know there is heterogeneity, but within the tumor also, you would see heterogeneity when you do molecular studies.
Yeah.
Right.
And as we move forward, our population is also getting more and more heterogeneous.
Yes.
Right.
So it's a challenge for precision medicine. How do we approach it?
Excellent.
Terrific question. Greater heterogeneity, but getting inside the tumor,
Right.
what's the answer?
And he appropriately identified two different types of heterogeneity. The heterogeneity of the tumor within one patient,
Right.
because not all the cells are the same,
Right.
and the heterogeneity of populations. So I'm going to address first the heterogeneity of a tumor in a patient. All the cells don't look the same. And actually, it's like a Darwin, you know, that you've got a population. And those cells will change. And survivors in other words, when we use a therapy, that's a stress. And the population of the cells changes and adapts differently. So what we have to do is more research about understanding how to give treatment. And the idea, again, this is what I was saying earlier, a lot of therapy and then continuously, bad. Some therapy, targeted and intermittently, probably better. And the research, including more research at Moffitt, has actually shown that that's the case. So understanding the heterogeneity also means that we have to sample a tumor at different sites to study the differences in the cell. I'm actually very excited about that because I think
I can tell.
understanding that heterogeneity is going to improve care.
And a population?
And the population, this again comes back to the ability to assign a patient to a community, okay? So what you want to do is get as much data as you possibly can, both clinically, in other words, is male, female, did they smoke, not smoke, those kind of things, and the molecular data. And you start looking at all the degrees of similarity, and you put this patient in their community so that you can study them, and then you start comparing communities. What's working for one community and not another? Even though under the microscope, the pathologist looks at a lung cancer and says, this is lung cancer. And you put all these lung cancers, they all look like lung cancer, when in fact they are very unique. And we need to be able to understand the parameters that make them unique so that we can, again, give the best therapy and predict what's going to work. Ultimately, what has been done historically is trial and error. This is this type of therapy that most of the time works, let's try it. And if that stops working, let's try something else. It's almost random. And what we want to be able to do is say, the data says you look like this community, and that data says you've got a better chance of responding to this therapy. And by following patients who have that therapy, we're now learning that they become resistant through this mechanism. So we're going to anticipate this mechanism evolving and starting to occur to you. So what could we do to prevent that mechanism to occur?
Fascinating. Other question? All right. Yes, sir. Right here.
So you talked about using, my name is Alan Zukowski, and I actually do information technology. I run my own company. But you talked about using the data for treatment. Are there plans, or are you using the data to form communities to find causes or those types of relationships?
Interesting.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Yes, part of the research we're doing in forming these communities, again, asking patients permission to follow them, we are looking at even environmental influences that might do it. For example, one of our partners in Orion is University of New Mexico. There's a population of Native Americans who are higher exposure to arsenic in their water. We're now beginning to study the populations of patients with cancer in that region who have a higher exposure to arsenic, and how are they doing compared to another population that has the same disease but didn't have that type of exposure. So those are the kind of questions you can ask when you form these collaborations. You know, if we were in each silo, we wouldn't be able to do that sort of thing. So
I think
understanding
front end
populations.
of the science, but it's interesting this morning, 7 a.m., I was having my oatmeal, and there's a story about Bayshore High School here. I don't know if any of you caught it. And the sense that many people have that in a certain age range of people have a very high incidence of cancer and in this area. So it looks like You know, who knows? I haven't
Right.
done the science, but it's just
Right.
certainly made the news this morning in a very relevant way. I saw you nodding your head. You saw the same news story, right? Yeah, it was, so it's interesting. Let me ask you just to close up. I am interested in how many of you guys have had your, either through like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, your genetic stuff sent out, right? How many, you know, put your hands up if you have. I have. So like 3 or 4. I'm interested, do you look at something like 23andMe, which is a company that goes out, looks at your genetic markers and proclivities for various things. Ancestry.com tells me I'm about 6.3% Neanderthal, which Margaret Lowe would completely agree with. But if you look at that, does that help bring in, to help create a greater openness to the kinds of things you're doing, or does that muck things up?
It's a double-edged sword. We need to be, especially certain populations are very sensitive about their heredity, their lineage. But we can learn, yes, different groups have greater risks. For example, African American males have a much greater risk of developing myeloma or prostate cancer. Why is that? That could be very informative and help not only the African American males, but tell us other things about the disease that we may be able to learn and then tailor therapy. So understanding, if you will, our genetic background, what makes us who we are, is extremely vital. And patients who come into our protocol allow us to study their normal cells as well. And it will also influence your ability to respond or not respond to a given therapy. The Native American population that I spoke of in New Mexico, there is a adolescent group of individuals who are Native American who have a specific genetic pool. They don't respond to the same therapies the way those that don't have those genetic variations. So understanding our genetics, not just the tumor genetics, but our genetics is extremely important about what will work, what are we at risk for. So that has to be part of the equation.
Well, thank you. It's one of the great cancer science leaders in America. I really appreciate your time and the conversation we've had. So ladies and gentlemen, William Dalton, founder and CEO of M2Gen, the Moffitt Cancer Center.
Thank you,
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.